No, we don't. There's a lot going on back there. So, all right. Good morning, everybody. I know there's a lot going on in the back, but if you are available and able to join us for Bible class, that'd be great. It's this one. That's the problem. Hope you guys had a great Thanksgiving. We did. Out at my parents' house here in Riverton. It was very nice. So. Starved to death. Not at all. All right, guys. Well, last week we talked about celibacy. And one of the comments that I got last week is, yes, I do know the true definition of celibacy, because I talked about singleness quite a bit last week. But on that note, we kind of talked about both singleness and celibacy kind of in one way, because I think singleness is kind of the thing we deal with more in our culture. So this week we're going to be talking about the opposite of that. We're going to be talking about polygamy, which, if you don't know, the definition of polygamy, since I need to define things before I start now, is having multiple spouses at a time. Whereas monogamy, I would say that right, is one spouse at a time, right? So a little bit of Latin roots at least, poly and mono. Poly meaning many, mono meaning one. So we're going to be talking about that from a biblical perspective this morning. We talk about polygamy. So, last week we started talking about celibacy and singleness, and kind of the first place you have to start when you're talking about anything like this was the very first example of any union of marriage, right? And so we talked about Genesis chapter 2, and I think that's kind of a fitting place to remind ourselves of again today. Genesis chapter 2, it's really verses 21 and following that talk about man and woman both existing on the earth, right? So Genesis chapter 1, God creates the whole world. The end of Genesis chapter 1, he creates man. And by the time we get to verse 21 in chapter 2, we read this last week too. Verse 20 says, but for Adam, for the man, there was not found a helper fit for him. So he did not have a helpmate. He did not have a helper. He did not have a partner. So in verse 21 and the next few verses, God causes a deep sleep to fall on Adam, and from his rib bone he makes woman, right? And so we see that woman is made, and woman is brought to Adam, to the man. And verse 24, kind of what we hung out on last week. Hello. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and the wife were both naked, and they were not ashamed. So we talked about this last week as the first marriage, even though it looks a lot different than American marriage, right? There was necessarily not any ceremony. There was not necessarily any witnesses except for God. You guys pointed that one out to me, right? There was no witnesses. There was no rings. There was not even any promises necessarily, except they were now two that had become one. And she's referred to as wife, right? So even though it doesn't look like what we would call a marriage these days, it was the first marriage. Two became one, and she was wife, and they were both naked and not ashamed. So all of those pieces come together to sound like a marriage to me. So, in the very first example of marriage, it's hard to talk about polygamy in this way, but in that very first example, there was only two people, right? There were only two people in the whole wide world, so that's a little unfair. But all the language used in chapter 2 was two become one, right? And so we kind of have just two different parties coming together as one. Now, have you guys ever had to talk about polygamy before? Well, hopefully not. Maybe there's some stories here. I don't know. Have you ever had to encounter this? Ever had a conversation with somebody that really thought they should have multiple wives or husbands, usually it's wives, right? Okay, well, that's good, I guess. We do have some religions in our culture that still are fond of polygamy. They may not practice it, but there are some groups that are still favorable on the idea. And so when it comes to polygamy in the Bible, what kind of stuff do we see? Other than Genesis chapter 2, there's only 2 people anyway. Christine?
Well, Abraham comes up pretty quickly and ends up with Hagar and Sarai.
Okay.
I don't know that it was a wife thing, but kind of it sounded like it, because later he has concubines, and so they don't call Hagar a concubine.
So we've got the example of Abram and Sarah, but then later Abraham and Hagar, right? And the example there is not a good one, not a pro multiple partner example, is it, right? That didn't work out very well. If you don't know, from that relationship came 2 different offspring, which became 2 different nations, which kept the separation for the rest of history, basically, right? So because there was two separate nations, 2 lineages that came from that. So that was not a good example of it working out.
If you go through the scripture, David and Solomon and all of those with the multiple wives, I'm not sure you really find a good example of polygamy in scripture.
I'm not sure you do either, but I have, yeah, Christine and then Brenda back there.
Leah and Rachel, and that was not good.
Not good. Yeah.
One positive note of polygamy, if there's such a thing.
Sandra said it.
The women of the Old Testament, then the Old Testament women weren't really worth much.
Okay.
They were kind of cast aside just to make babies. And they would, the husband would die, they would take the woman in. They gave her protection and gave her where she wouldn't die, she had food to eat. And if her spouse was there, she could have children, carry on the family name. That would be the good side of it. No, it's not good. It's not what God did.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good thing to consider. But I was thinking of historical examples too, and I couldn't really find any that were shining examples.
No.
Right.
The first example of polygamy was Cain's 5th generation that had 2 wives.
Okay. And we don't know a lot about that. We can't say if it was a good or a bad, but again, we're kind of presuming it didn't work out super great.
Perhaps Esther might be a positive.
Perhaps what's that?
Esther,
Okay.
Queen Esther, Vashti was the queen, and there's many others that vied to be queen. So wives or concubines or whatever, there's a year worth, it sounds like, every night. So there's many hundred. But Esther was able to do a lot of really good for the Jewish nation and she wasn't favored for any reason with, I think it's Darius is the king.
Yeah. So one of the examples I thought of was obviously David historically has had multiple wives and concubines, right? But yet he also struggled with that. I thought of the story of at the time of Bathsheba, he already has, I would consider, his fill of wives, right? But yet he still is plagued with the struggle over Bathsheba. He has to take another, right? And the rest of that story is not good. What's the worst part of that story? The fact that he stole someone's wife? The fact that he killed someone to have her? The fact that he that he was spying on her, if you want to use that word? What was the worst part? None of it was good. It all kind of snowballed, right?
How about the fact that the baby died because of his sin?
Yeah. But is that dedicated completely to polygamy? I don't know. I mean, David still had to struggle with that.
Well, so I'm going to go with Sandra over here. The positive was for the wives, maybe not the husbands, because Abigail is one of his wives. And that was definitely to her benefit to marry King David versus just being a widow out there, because again, as she said, although they seem to be pretty prosperous, her and her husband, who I can't even think of his name, but he was a jerk, and she saves them, but then he dies anyway, nobody's listening to her. So who's gonna carry on the family farm?
Okay, so polygamy is a good thing.
No, you're asking for examples. I'm trying to
Brenda,
find.
did you have something? Henri?
On Bathsheba, the relationship was wrong, but God did bless at the end
Yeah.
with two sons being the generation of Jesus. I mean, there was two of Bathsheba's sons. No other sons of David was awarded the lineage of Christ, but two sons of Bathsheba was awarded the lineage of Christ.
So, if somebody is talking to you, and again, thankfully in our culture we don't have to wrestle with this conversation very often, but I could see that someone would talk to you and say, you know, polygamy's great, it's cool, I like it, we're following that plan, me and my family, and they'd say, you know, if you look at the Bible, you have tons of examples of polygamy happening, and they wouldn't be wrong, right? We talk about tons of examples. So if as Christians we want to say that this is something that is not right, where's the Bible verse that says it?
Matthew 19.
Okay, that's my second one, but yeah, I got there. We'll get to Matthew 19 first. Jesus himself, right? Matthew 19, 4 and 5, is that the verses you want, Jen?
I don't know, I'm looking right now.
Okay, I think it is because those are the ones I wrote down. So Jesus is talking about the same thing we just talked about in Genesis chapter 2. He's replying to the answer and he's using history, right? He's using Genesis chapter 2. And the question is, can you ever divorce your wife? It's a trapping question, of course it is. It's to Jesus, right? So Matthew 19 verse 4, Jesus answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? He made them uniquely different, right? Male and female. And he said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife. And the two shall become one flesh. Again, that wording from Genesis. The two shall become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. Okay, just want to read that.
And I think verse 8 is important. It says, because of the hardness of your heart, Moses permitted you. So it was man's doing and not God's doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question that they're asking, even on divorce, is what Jen's pointing out. Even on divorce, Jesus is pointing out it's man's doing that divorce is even an idea, right? And I agree with that. It's man's doing that divorce is even an idea in our brains, right? Because God created marriage to be one man, one female, different, put together as one, where they leave their other families and now become one flesh, is the word that Jesus said, right? So that's kind of a weird wording, but I think we understand it to some degree. It's like, okay, we are now a complete unit. You can't take one flesh apart, right? Well, I guess you can, but it doesn't remain living. It's maybe a good example, right? So Jesus himself would say, not only talking about divorce, but I think he's also talking about one person to marry here, right? One person to marry. So, is that enough example of polygamy?
It's extrapolating.
Yeah, it's a little bit, right? So would I be able to tell somebody they shouldn't have multiple wives with that? This is what Herod wrestled with. Bill's back there a little worried that I'm going to tell you you can have multiple wives.
Further on in verse 9, as Jim was reading, the reason you can leave your wife is sexual immorality. Commits adultery. If it was allowed to have more than one, if it was designed, that wouldn't be there.
Absolutely, right, because that wouldn't make any sense, right?
It's one
Self-defeating statement, kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The scripture that I was looking at is not actually necessarily for everybody, but a leader in the church, and it's Timothy 1. I think it says it in there twice. And it specifically says, husband of one wife, and then further down, again, it says, husband of one wife.
All right, everybody rewind 30 seconds. You didn't hear that. That's next. Okay. That's Kim. Put a pin in it. It's next. Christine, and then we'll come back around to
We're
Nancy.
gonna get her first, I'm saying.
Nancy?
Totally forgot what it said.
Jen?
1 Corinthians 7:2. because of immorality, each man is to have his own wife and each woman is to have her own husband.
That's good, right? So that's kind of, again, an example of the one. One and one makes one, right?
Oh,
Okay, Nancy?
I was just thinking that, if your spouse leaves you and divorces you, there's nothing you can do about it.
That's not true either.
Well, my husband's first wife divorced him, he didn't want a divorce, and the judge was like, too bad, so sad, we're granting your wife a divorce.
Well, I'm gonna redirect us back to
You can't stop your
the
spouse from divorcing you.
the definition of multiple spouses at a time. That's where we're gonna hang out today, okay?
I'm
I'm
just,
just gonna hang us out there, because we talked about divorce a little bit before too, so.
Well, now we've also, she kind of entered this, and it definitely counts with the multiple spouses. We have the law of the land.
Sure.
Now, the law of the land says we should not have more than one spouse, but it also says we should not, that it's, I'm going for too young, when they're too young. I'm not, maybe arranged marriages, and not, it doesn't go there, but it definitely says you can't get married without permission at most states unless you're 16, and then I'm not even sure I'm gonna say some of the South states is maybe younger, and I think it's okay in some of the South states, as long as parents okay, it doesn't matter the age, but I think there are some states that say the age is, you can't get married no matter what, under 13 or something like that. So there's laws of the land that govern this.
Our cultural one, you're talking about, like in
Yes.
the United States, yeah. So, I mean, if we're trying to live by under those laws, which we are, it's wise to abide by them, right? Dennis?
Well, by the time, I don't know about by the time of Abraham, but probably by the time of Christ, hundreds and hundreds of years later, there was polygamy all over all what we currently know parts of the world. And there's even quite a bit today in places. And an interesting question would be, we know God hates divorce, it flat out says that. We never see that it says he hates polygamy in that strong of words. And the Christian question might be, did Jesus and the early apostles and stuff command their polygamous people to get rid of some spouses? If so, from the first back or from the last one first? I mean,
From the middle outward.
yeah, or the middle outward. But yeah, I mean, is there anything that would indicate in the New Testament scriptures Christians were supposed to get rid of their polygamous spouses?
Well, we're gonna come back to Kim's thing in a minute here. It's not indicative that they had to get rid of when the church started, but we can see as the church is starting and growing, where Kim was at. That's where I'm gonna hang out here in a minute. Greg?
I don't know if it's so much on the polygamy subject, but when Jesus was at the well with the lady, if you notice, he showed her love as he told her about all of her marriages.
Yeah.
And he did not judge her. And, but I mean, that's not polygamy, I know, but it is along with different husbands, different marriages.
Yeah, and it kind of connects to Dennis's thing of,
Definitely.
how would Jesus approach that, right? The woman at the well is an example of how Jesus would approach somebody who'd been married lots of times, right? That's a good one for us to hang on sometimes, because we deal with that more often than polygamy.
It's interesting that we're having the discussion now. In 1990, when I was in Kenya, we were we were doing a mission trip and went to Uganda for a little while. And through an interpreter, the ladies of the church were asking the Christian young women questions. And the first one was, there's a man and his two wives and they're all Christian. And then they asked us the question, which was the oldest wife wanted to go live with the son, and was that allowed? And the beginning of the question threw us. And so it was still practiced and still accepted by the church in 1990 in Uganda.
It's really, it's kind of not fair that we don't have a lot to talk about because we don't have a lot in our culture. I mean, we do live in a part of America that might have more favorable sides of that, but America as general does not ever deal with polygamy, right? But some places, like Uganda in 1990s, still do. right? So it's kind of not fair. We have no perspective on it.
Well, don't we through the LDS church, the early church?
I would be careful with who I was saying. Yes, right? Some
Yeah.
of the Utah history is
Yeah.
deeply rooted in that,
There's
right?
still a sect that does it today.
And there is, yeah.
And large part of Wyoming too.
Yeah. So again, in America, we're probably closer than most. We're closer than Tennessee people to dealing with this, but still, we don't really favor it. You know, like I said, when was the last time we had a conversation about it? So, as a Christian now, let me go with Nancy first.
I was just thinking, in the Bible, we have many instances of men having multiple wives, but we have no instances of a woman having multiple husbands.
And that kind of goes back to Sandra's comment too, just of the culture and the time and the value of women and men at the time, right? So women were cared for, they were also looked upon as property. So both of those coming into play, probably why, right? So if we want to be Christians, we want to be the New Testament church. Dennis is bringing us to the New Testament church here a minute ago. He said, so those new Christians possibly might have had multiple wives, right? We don't know for sure. Were they supposed to get rid of some wives, and how do they choose which one, or whatever? We don't have an answer to that. We don't see any example. But as we grow as the church, we do see examples of, again, what Jesus had said, one wife, one husband, becoming one. Brenda, did you have something else there?
There was special rules for multiple wives, but they had to give each wife respect and honor. They could not neglect one wife because they loved one wife over the other. There were special rules, and because of those rules, God tried to protect the different wives. But God did set in certain rules for polygamy.
Jen?
I'm gonna disagree with something you said, just a little bit.
Okay.
1 Corinthians, 7:24. So if we're talking about the first century church, these people being called, it says, brethren, each one of you is to remain with God in the condition he was called. So if he was a polygamist and then became a Christian, he's to remain in that. That's where I'm kind of going to disagree with you a little bit.
And I agree
And
with
it's
your
hard to-
disagreement, because we kind of talked about that a little bit when we talked about homosexuality, right? And that's even trickier, right? Because we were talking about practicing versus the desire, enticement, or whatever word you want to use there, right?
Genetic.
But homosexuality says that it's an abomination from God. Pearl marriage does not say that.
And again,
And I think that says a lot.
well, and again, practicing is a big part of those verses too, if you look at it. These are all action words. The polygamy, I don't know if it is or isn't. Yes, it is, but on the other hand, coming as you are, right? So that's tricky. It's tricky.
To kind of put some perspective on that, then Peter comes forward and says, I have this dream that meat from idols is wrong if you think it's wrong, but God says everything's clean. So that's from their old life. The idol eating meat thing would be problematic for some,
Sure.
perhaps. I mean, it sounds like it, but it doesn't say you can't do that, even though you've been doing that. If
Well-
you think it's a problem. Now, I mean, can you put this in with the polygamy? Well, maybe.
Maybe.
Well, and I think where she's going is, the clean and the unclean in that dream of Peter's was also calling Jews and Gentiles.
Yes.
So you have different views on marriage there as well.
But I would guess the Gentiles have a whole lot more polygamy going on.
I think so too.
Yeah, so.
It's interesting that in the talk about marriage and all those things that Jesus said in the beginning, it was not so. God hates divorce. I never see such a strong statement about polygamy.
And that's kind of what Jen was saying about homosexuality too, an abomination
Yes,
versus,
that's a strong word.
and that's a strong word, right? Just like hates. I'm gonna be really careful here, but we want to talk about what Kim said earlier, because that's what I had for bread and butter here. If we want to be the New Testament church, we want to look at some of the examples given to the New Testament church on anything, right? And that's why we take communion in the way we take communion. We look at how Jesus gave communion. He gave that Last Supper. We do it in a similar way as much as we can. If we want to look at marriage, we want to look at how the church and how Jesus established marriage. So we looked at Jesus saying that it was one and one becoming one, right? And now we can look at examples of the church. So Kim's example was out of 1 Timothy, which I moved from because Jen had something else. 1 Timothy chapter 3, right? And if you dig through 1 Timothy chapter 3, what's that? 3 and 12. Well, okay, we can, or Titus, and we'll get to Titus too. You see the descriptions of leadership in the church, right? So very first thing in chapter 3, you'll see overseers, pastors, shepherds are the words that are probably used in your Bible. Talking about elders, or elders might be used in your Bible too. So the people who watch over the flock of the church, people who watch over the sheep, who guide them, take care of them, who look after them. And what is one of the descriptions of an overseer, of a pastor, of an elder?
You must be the husband of one wife.
Verse 2, right? Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, and able to teach. Right there, second one is the husband of one wife. I would think at the very least, again, we're not going to be talking about our necessarily if we got this down perfectly or not, but at the very least, that means he only has one right thing. Okay? At the very least.
At the very least.
At the very least, I'm going to say it that way.
Well, and if you keep going just a bit farther, it talks in 5, yeah, but, okay, well, I missed 4. But in 5, he manages his own household. So that indicates that there's not the David infighting stuff going on.
With multiple households. Right?
Even if you have a previous wife and a current wife or something going on like that. Stepkids is what because that's far more applicable to what we got going these days.
Yeah, that's a good point. So again, I'm saying it very carefully. At the very least, he has one wife right then, okay? Now there's lots of different discussions we can have of can he ever have multiple, I mean, what is multiple, right? But one wife married at that time is a safe starting point. So I think for somebody to be a leader in the church, like a shepherd or a pastor or an elder, they would need to just be married once, not have multiple wives, not be polygamous. We'll go with Ken's second piece here, verse 12, right? We're talking about somebody else next in verse 12. Let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children in their own households as well. Basically the same thing as just talked about shepherds, but do you guys remember when we talked about deacons, what are deacons?
Servants.
Servants. Worker bees, right? Serving people. So, we're talking kind of more a little bit more general public church people now, aren't we? We're talking about people that serve others. We see that some of the first deacons that are pretty much the ones that are labeled in Scripture are chosen for a specific task, and they choose 7 of them to take care of different jobs. So what? So the apostles could keep preaching and not have to worry about distributing the food and doing the serving roles, right?
Was that from the 120 that had kind of been around? I don't remember.
We would be more than that at that point.
Okay, but it wasn't that from this group that had been around a long time, like they did for the replacing of Judas.
No, that was Matthias where they replaced Judas.
I know. I'm just asking if it was the same group.
I don't know if we have any indication of that because it's after the start of the church in the Acts.
But it was before Stephen was killed, so it's getting pretty close to there. That's where I would kind of put it.
Kind of in that slice of time.
Yes.
I asked that
It
because
just says in those days when the number of disciples was increasing.
okay. I asked that because I'm wondering if it was just from those who had been with him longer, but it doesn't sound like that.
So the 12 gathered all the disciples together and said.
Okay.
So it was all of whoever was all at that moment.
Yeah, and then it says they picked out from among them 7 good men of repute, full of wisdom, who will be appointed to this duty. So, again, we looked at that when we looked at the elders and then deacons, servants, right? These 7 were chosen specifically to serve in this way, to take care of this need. And they were chosen by their brothers and sisters, right? So this is not the whole church yet, but it's a good little slice of people who work and who serve and who lead. They should be, at the very least, a husband of one wife. That's just one, at least at a time. Okay, just one right now. Yeah.
Can I make a comment about the church as a whole? And basically, like, they said, you know, come as you are, be who you are, but going forward, be better, know better. Like, you know better, just be better. So therefore, like, they accepted them, but they're like, okay, but you're the last of your kind, and you're allowed to do this. Be better because you know better.
Yeah, and that's kind of what Jen and Dennis are bouncing back and forth on, too, of, you know, Jen's saying, as you come, the condition you come, for lack of better words, is the condition you come, right?
Well, and then I think moving forward, like if you, using the men, because they're to be deacons, you know, teach your children. These are the mistakes that I have made. This is what the Bible says. So, I mean, we need to teach our kids. We were told that throughout all of the Old Testament. Teach your children. It still applies to the New Testament. These are my sins. And one of the people, Jace with Duck Dynasty, had a talk with his son Reed, and he said, these are the things that I messed up with you. You do better.
Yeah.
And that's great advice.
And we don't, again, because of our current cultural, we aren't going to say, you know, sorry, son, I had multiple wives in polygamy way, but we might have to have that conversation when it comes to divorce and, like Christine said, step families. It's, you know, it's okay to admit your imperfections to teach people, especially your children, right? Absolutely.
Which I was just gonna, I think in this way, it is very applicable to every single one of us, because we all fall short and sin. So what Kim was saying and what Jen is saying is that we can teach our kids to improve from where we are and use ourselves as examples of what you don't want to do.
Yeah. So on that, and then what Kim said a minute ago here before we move on. One of my favorite quotes I've seen recently is, Jesus says, come as you are, not stay as you are, right? Because that's what Kim was saying too. It's like, yeah, come as you are. I mean, absolutely. But don't just stay there. Get better. Help the church. Let the church help you. Let Christ live in you, right? Dennis, did you have something too? And then we'll go.
Yeah, I think all of us know, and without pointing out specific verses, that I think we all probably would agree that there's a general tendency that what we call the Old Testament, the old system, I'm not talking about the package of books, I'm talking about the system, at least back as far as Moses, on down to the time Jesus got here, and that it was pointing ahead to a better time, the age of Christianity, and it was given examples and so on. And it's kind of interesting, some are more strict than what Christians later had, and some are less strict than things the later Christians had. And but anyway, the New Testament, we should be looking toward as Christians or God's people, saints, whatever you want to call us. We should be striving and wanting God's ideal rather than how much will he put up with.
Yeah. Instead of how far can I cross the line, how can I do my best to never be there, right? Brenda, and then we'll come up to Terry.
When the Jerusalem Council met to discuss the Gentiles, they did not say anything about polygamy or divorcing or anything else. That was not one of the topics. That we try to make a lot of things law, where the Jerusalem Council was careful not to make a lot of things law. And I get upset because a lot of times we make things as law, when it should be a guide.
Yeah.
We should use it as a guide instead of a law. And if we use it as a guide, we can see Christ had one bride, the church. And that was our example of his having one bride, the church. But all of it is a guide. If you look at the Jerusalem Council, there was nothing about polygamy or about a lot of the things that we make as law.
Sure. Terry?
I'm actually gonna bounce right off of that, because I'm curious, if there's not a thou shalt not commit polygamy in the New Testament, which there really doesn't seem to be, do we have any other thoughts or reasons as to why it's not a good idea? If somebody came to us and said, all right, we know it's not scripture, what other reasons would you say, especially if they live someplace where it is legal?
So,
What God intended.
we're going for the logical side of things now, right? Possibly. And that's kind of where you can look at those Old Testament examples and say, no, there's not a lot of, at the very least, not a lot of successful polygamy stories, even when they was practicing, right? What else you guys have? From the more logical side of things. Not necessarily is there a verse that says I can't, because that's what Brenda was saying too, or Dennis, trying to cross the line. What we talked about, why it's probably not a great idea.
Well, I'm gonna go back to 1 Corinthians 7:24, where it says, one husband, one wife.
Okay, so I don't care about being a deacon or an elder, can I have more than one wife?
Well, that 7, the First
Well,
Corinthians
that's-
one is not about.
Yeah, it's not talking about deacons.
The length of the honeydew list.
This is really like, Courtney's not even, why are some of our wives are gone?
Actually, that was verse 2, sorry.
Yeah, so 1 Corinthians 7:2.
Yeah.
Each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband, right? What was I gonna say? Man, one's enough, right? Your wife's not in here, so that. You agree on that? One's enough, yeah. Do you have something else?
Did you say the length of the honeymoon list?
Honeydew. Honeydew.
I was thinking it's Solomon.
So there is not, and again, there is not, like a lot of these, a verse that says exactly the thou shalt not. But again, if we look at what is communicated through Scripture, we look at what Jesus talked about, we look about who wants to be a servant and a leader in the church, I think it's pretty safe to get to a conclusion of the point is over and over again that it's one guy, one woman, now becoming one flesh. And we don't talk about that enough in our culture either. And this is now an unbreakable, when you do not take apart one flesh without killing it, right? I'm not trying to be morbid here, but if you got an animal, you can't take an animal apart, it will die. Same is true for humans, same is true for marriages. And so that is what Jesus is saying, and then you look at the examples of leaders in the church and servants in the church, and one of the descriptions of them is they have one spouse, right? One spouse, one husband or one wife. So that means they only have that one husband, for sure, at the very least. So I think the logical answer would be New Testament Christians that call us to be husbands and wives of one husband and one wife, right? So, I don't know, we don't talk about it that much.
Again, on the logical side,
Sure.
wouldn't this tie into the sermons that you're doing on the fruit of the Spirit? We're supposed to add to these things and always be improving?
So, like Kim said too.
Yeah, exactly. Just more boots on the ground. Another spot maybe you could reference. Does this have to do with polygamy? No. Does it have to do with a lot of things? Well, actually, it does have to do with a lot of things about our improving ourselves. So, it kind of feels logically like this fits with what the New Testament is doing as they're moving forward, the church there, and we're following that example, trying to improve ourselves. It seems like they're leaving polygamy behind, because if you're being kind and good and loving and joyful, the honeydew list, and you can find some things there that fit pretty well.
If you carry that to its logical conclusion, 1 Corinthians 7 actually talks about not marrying at all.
Yes.
Yes.
You know, because those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and want to spare you this. I'd like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord, how he can please the Lord, but a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world and how he can please his wife. And his interests are divided. So are we going to the other thing that says all Christians should be unmarried?
Well, we talked about celibacy last week, but really Harold talked about singleness, because that's really what I thought was the more important, right? And what I shared, again, this is just Harold, is both are good. But we have the tendency to go the other way, right? The unmarried is well, that's tough, but actually Paul's saying the opposite there, right? And the church historically has said, oh, no, you got to be married to be productive Christian. That's not true. Paul's saying it right there, too. So I'm going to leave that be because we talked about singleness a little bit. We talked about polygamy a little bit. You don't have an answer that says this verse, but I think you have a logical thought. Now, we've got 2 minutes, 3 minutes. What if somebody next week walked in the door, him and his 2 wives? Let's put some real boots on the ground.
We greet them with love.
Nancy?
Okay, so I don't know, I mean, the whole Old Testament and Abraham and, I mean, well, he didn't have multiple, but after Sarah, he did have another wife, but, and all these other people and everything, so I've always like, why is it such a big deal? But Jesus says we must obey the law of the land.
That's what my mom said too, yes.
So, I probably missed it. So, the law of the land says one wife, one husband. So, or, well, actually, I don't know, 2 men, 2 women. I'm confused now.
Well, I'm still asking a question, and Greg had a good point on it a minute ago. I'm gonna give it back to him.
I would ask where they're from.
Yeah. But I think his point earlier that he talked about the woman as well kind of apply a little bit, right?
I would ask them where they are. Like, where are you at in your Christian walk? I mean, as far as, are you a Christian? Are you gathering more wives? You're in the wrong place. I mean, I think.
So those are both deep questions, but they're friendly questions too. They don't have to be scary questions, right? You can find that out about people by being friendly.
And I think we tend to whip right over to the judgment side. But we have this happen in our congregations frequently, different things. People come in dressed quite differently than we might encourage them to do. Up in our congregation, we have people who come in intoxicated or homeless and fall asleep. And we actually feel pretty honored that they're safe enough to be that way in our midst. So maybe we need to think about this in a little broader sense. And it's not that we condone that. We take people where they are, just like they take us where we are.
Very true.
So that's a good thing to chew on this week. I'll let Dennis have the last comment, because I think it's a good thing to think about how we would.
Well, the early Christians did and were told to search the scriptures again and again and again. And at that time, it meant what we call the Old Testament, 39 books or so. And because they didn't have Matthew through Revelation yet.
Right.
But anyway, it's kind of interesting. Solomon asked God a question, the very thing he asked for, wisdom. It pleased God, and then God gives him this huge list of blessings. One of those, it kind of enumerates a whole bunch of wives and concubines and stuff. And like it's not negative except for the fact that a lot of them were pagans and they led his heart astray from the one God. Job, on the other hand, if I read Job carefully, right at the beginning it says he was a good and upright man, pleased God and all this, and clear through the whole story. He had just one wife, and she told him to curse God and die before the story was over. So, I don't know, man.
All right, we'll leave it on that, but I want you guys to think about how we would interact and what we should do if that ever comes across. It's not different than many other things, like Christine was saying. But sometimes we have to prepare our minds to be ready for that. All right, guys, I'll see you in a few minutes. We'll be back for our assembly.
Yeah.
I just read one yesterday. I did want to swallow, but it was blended together. Basically, it's association and like the daughter.
I never met Matthews out of the world. All right, folks, that's the culture.
Erase all of that, and the whole thing is about the fact that a lot of associations don't decide.
After all, I'm getting the video. All right. One of those. Oh, good morning.
Good morning.
How are you, Mike?
Staying here, right?
I'm waiting. You know what happens the most? It's like it blows my mind. You know, it's just a train wreck. So I live right beside Rumors on Jackson. And I cook, and you know what? Where Jesus all the food on time. Only one person said thank you. And I told him, I'd rather be trust me.
Because when Mike got on your phone, I said, where's Grace?
And took her for
And
a
you
walk.
called and he's like,
This is my mom, Barb.
I know, how are you?
No, I will.
Next year, if they ask you, if you do this again.
Yeah.
This is the first time, and you do it, and they ask you for something.
Oh. I felt so bad, and it turned out to be a disaster, except that my three dogs were late.
I didn't think you told me yours.
Yeah. Oh, they had, one of them was going with the leg.
So, how are you?
Isn't that something? Oh, you cooked one finger?
And he said,
And I still fed him though.
so they asked you.
I don't know what that thing is. It's part of that.
He's double.
I'm gonna get ready for video or I've got
Yep.
I'm gonna get ready. All that food stuff.
They've never seen that much in any other time. They were like, trying to step with the rods down. They were just, she said, that's just fast.
I yearn for peace and rest. I don't want to end up where you found. And it echoes in my mind, keeps me awake tonight. I know you've cast my sins far. East is from west, and I stand before you now, as though I've never sinned.